Well, brethren, I want to talk about a subject very basic to us, and that's the Sabbath. And I'll preface this by going back to when I was a young man, about 14 years old. And it was about that time that my father and I began listening to The World Tomorrow. Heard that voice on the radio. Herbert W. Armstrong and The World Tomorrow. I mean, we can all remember that. And we're taking the Plain Truth magazine and the Bible correspondence course, and God was opening our minds to the truth, and I remember how it was with all of us. It was exciting, right? It was thrilling. You couldn't wait to sit down and start reading your Bible. God was opening all these new truths to you, and it was a time. It was an exciting process. It's one that I think I will always remember. Well, we had grown up in the Nashville, Tennessee area mostly, and we were members of a large, respected Protestant church in the Nashville area. I won't mention the name of the denomination, but my mother had been raised in this denomination and was very well known in the Middle Tennessee area, and she had brothers who were pastors of small churches in this denomination. She had nephews that we're deacons and elders in this church. I have a cousin today who's on the board of elders of probably the second largest church of this denomination in the world. And so we were a part of that. And so you can imagine that the problems that arose when we began to understand the truth of God's Sabbath. I'll never forget that when we stopped attending church on Sunday morning, and that raised a few eyebrows. Um, we weren't really prominent in that church. As I said, my uncle was on the board of deacons of that church, but we were not. We were just average members, but it was noticeable that we weren't coming anymore. So, dutifully, our pastor of that church, who was fairly prominent in the area, had his own television program at the time and everything else. He called up my father and said, "Well, we want to come out and talk to you all." He was going to rescue us from this horrible heresy that we had gotten into, this heresy of believing in the Jewish Sabbath, and he thought he had just the verse to convince us. If you will, please turn to Acts 20, verse 7. I think most of us are probably familiar with this. It's a passage used by a lot of Protestant denominations to try to, quote, prove the Sabbath. So we read this: on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart on the next day, keep that in mind. Paul, ready to depart on the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. Verse 8, and there were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together. So what does this immediately tell us? What does this immediately tell us? This was an evening event, wasn't it? They don't have many lamps in the upper room when it's broad daylight. I really want to discuss 3 points that kind of proves that this verse is erroneously used to try to prove Sunday keeping, and that we have many proofs of the Sabbath in the Bible. First point was that the Hebrew days were from sunset to sunset. Okay, sunset to sunset. Does anybody remember the Young Ambassadors group from Ambassador College? And there was an album they had, actually 2 or 3 of them, I think, called Sunset to Sunset. My wife and I still have 2 or 3 of those LP vinyl albums. God ordained the Sabbath from sunset to sunset. He ordained the days of the week from sunset to sunset. Sunday was not mentioned in this verse. The verse that was mentioned was the first day of the week. But let's go ahead and start looking at what God said about the Sabbath. If you will, turn back to Genesis, the very first chapter, the creation chapter of the Bible, Genesis 1. I'm not going to read this whole chapter, but if we start with, say, verse 5, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. We can drop down a couple of verses to verse 8. God called verse 7, God created the firmament, and verse 8, God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And then if we read on further, we hear about God finishing up on the 6th day, and then the Sabbath was the first was the day of rest. So God ordained the Sabbath at creation. And I mean, that's something we all know. I don't think we really need to dwell on that too much. But it is important that we begin by understanding that the evening and the morning were the first day. Okay? God ordained that the new day begin in the evening after sunset. See further proof of this in Leviticus 23:32, if you want to turn there. Leviticus 23 and verse 32. Okay? And it shall be to you a Sabbath of solemn rest. God again instructing Moses on the holy days. And you shall afflict your souls on the 9th day of the month at even, this of course referring to atonement, from evening to evening. So shall you celebrate your Sabbath. So the first point again, God established the Sabbath is evening to evening. So what do we see if this was clearly a nighttime event? Was it the Sabbath evening or was it another day? Let's take a look at what the Romans said about the days. It was the Romans who started the practice of beginning their days at midnight. Now, we know that all of our Western society are permeated, just saturated with Roman customs and Roman practices that still persist to this day, more than 2,000 years later. The Romans began this process of beginning their days at midnight. So, and there again, it's further proof of the Romans of how their influences influenced us. Consider the fact that we have a Roman calendar. We have days of the year or months of the year called September, October, November, and December. These are Roman terms. Sept being the Roman term for 7, oct being the Roman term for 8. We have talked about octagons, octets in music. 9, November being the Roman term for 9, and for 9, and DEC being the Roman term for 10. We use the decimal system. So these were the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th months of the year, and there were other months that came afterward. Well, we had a couple of emperors came along. One was called Julius Caesar. He wanted his own month, and guess what he named it? July, after himself. His nephew, Augustus, who was, of course, the emperor at the time of Christ's birth, not to be outdone by his uncle, he said, well, I'm going to have my own month too, and I'm going to call it after me. My name is Augustus. I'm going to call it August. So the Romans had permeated the whole system, our whole system of timekeeping, and they began to permeate it back then. I don't know, possibly it may even started with the Greeks before them, but certainly this was the extent during the Roman times. So the point being that this was the evening. This was the evening. From a Hebrew perspective, the time period, the first day of the week, we put everything else together. There were lights in the upper room. This was Saturday night. This was Saturday night. This is what this was. Paul had begun preaching on the Sabbath day. He was going to be leaving the next day. He wanted to spend as much time as he could with the brethren at Troas, what we call Troy today. I went to a high school. The high school I went to was Goodlettsville High School, north of Nashville. Our teams were called the Trojans. So Troy was a prominent city in ancient times. So Paul was at Troas or Troy. He had been there for a week, as the previous verses to Acts 27 tell us, and he would want to spend time with the brethren. So he preached to them until Saturday night, till it was late, and then he finally ended his message because he had to leave the next day. The second point is breaking bread. Is that another term for the Lord's Day, or what some denominations call the Eucharist? No. What is breaking bread? Does the phrase "when the disciples came together" refer to the Lord's Supper? Well, it doesn't. A basic rule of Bible study, of course, as we all know, is we have to get the context of what's happening in order to properly understand the scriptures involved, and that certainly applies here. So as I mentioned earlier, the immediately preceding verse 6, tells us that Paul was in Troas, or Troy, where he had been for 7 days. He was about to leave the next day, and so he's taking a final opportunity to have a fellowship meal with the disciples before leaving. The term breaking bread refers to actually eating a meal, okay? Turn over, if you will, to Acts 20, verse 11. This is kind of proof of this. Acts 20, verse 11. Now, we had the incident, of course, of the young man, Eutychus, I think his name was, who was sitting in this was an upper room in a third story, and he was sitting in the window in the third story, and he got sleepy at Paul's preaching, and he fell out of the window and killed himself. Maybe there's a lesson there to all of our pastors. I think there may be a lesson there somewhere. But anyway, even Paul's preaching was enough to put Eutychus to sleep after a while. Eutychus fell out, and of course, we know the rest of the story that Paul resurrected him. But notice on verse 11, now when he had come up and had broken bread and eaten, okay, he ate breakfast, he talked a long while, even daybreak, until he departed. They brought the young man in alive, as they were not a little bit comforted. So then, verse 13, then he went ahead in a ship and sailed to Assos, there intending to take Paul on board. Then we went ahead in a ship and sailed to Assos, intending to take Paul on board, for he had so given orders, intending himself to go on foot. So, the second point to reiterate, breaking bread is not the Lord's Supper. Would Paul have observed the Lord's Supper both on Saturday night and then again the next morning? I don't think so. It was breaking bread was eating a meal. We use that term here in the South quite a bit, don't we? Breaking bread. You hear it especially out in rural areas a lot. Come in and break bread with us. It's a common term. So that'd be the second point that we need to keep in mind. The third point is that finally, Paul worked on the first day of the week. He did not worship. I'll say that again. Paul worked on the first day of the week. He did not worship. Let's go back to verses 13 and 14 in Acts 20. Then we went ahead, we being Paul's traveling companions, in a ship and sailed to Assos, there intending to take Paul on board. I started to make a little map of this, but I didn't know if from here people would be able to see it, probably be able to see it too well. But this is a peninsula, and Troas is on one side of the peninsula, and Assos is on the other side. These traveling companions were going to go and sail around the peninsula in a sailing ship of the time. Paul, the next day, was going to go on foot. There again, we're intending to take Paul on board, for so he had given orders, intending himself to go on foot. Verse 14, and so when he met us at Assos, we took him on board, and then we came or sailed to Mytilene. Now, the distance across that peninsula is about 18 miles. 18 miles. Paul's intent was to spend the daylight part of the first day of the week walking from Troas to Assos. And then he would get on the ship with his companions. I don't think too many Protestant denominations would consider that would be a good way to spend the first day of the week. We were told in this denomination, you rest on the first day of the week. You don't do a lot of work. Of course, a lot of our people went out and operated their businesses on the first day of the week and did all, went hunting and fishing and so forth. But you weren't supposed to, okay? So Paul, the point here, of course, is Paul was working on the first day of the week. He was walking a distance of 18 miles. That'd be a good trek for anybody, even today. He was not worshiping on the first day of the week. He wasn't going to church services. And the meal he ate that morning was breakfast. It was not some kind of Lord's Supper. So what do we conclude from this? We certainly do not see proof of the first day of Sunday in those passages. What we do see is a lot of proof all through the book of Acts. We do see a lot of proof from the Sabbath. I'm just going to read a few of these real quickly. You don't need to turn. I'm going to move pretty quickly through these, at least as quick as my fingers will allow me. The first, Acts 1:12, okay? Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet. This was after Christ was resurrected, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey. Acts 13, verse 14. I'm remember several passages in Acts 13, okay? And, I think most of us are familiar with these. Acts 13, verse 14. But when they had departed from Perga, they came to Antioch in Pisidia, and they went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down. If we drop down to verse 27, what do we see? For those who dwell in Jerusalem and their rulers, because they did not know him, nor even the voices of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath, have committed them in condemning him, or have fulfilled them in condemning him. In other words, they were saying that it was prophesied that Christ would be betrayed and killed by his own people on the Sabbath day. So then we can drop down to verse 42 of that same chapter. So when the Jews went out of the synagogue, the disciples begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. Notice that the Gentiles begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. Do you think the Gentiles kept the Sabbath at that time? No, they didn't keep any day. They were pagans. You know. But they desired that those words be preached to them on the next Sabbath. Not on the first day of the week, on the next Sabbath. I think that's powerful. It really is. So we could go on with more proofs of the Sabbath, but I think the point is well proven. We don't ignore God's many commands to observe the Sabbath, listening instead to those who grasp at straws and trying to prove that Sunday has replaced the Sabbath. As God's people today, we observe the day God set aside, that he ordained as the day of rest, and he never changed it, God's Sabbath day.